like tearing up. And I don't know if it's because of the week that we've had, the last couple of weeks, or because this is my first, well, it's my second, um, but first in terms of our Lutheran family kind of speaking event for 2021. I don't know if it's because Lois, you did a fantastic job of encapsulating who I am and how I strive to be in the world. And I don't know if it's just that I'm tired. Like, it could be any of those things, right? In the midst of this world that we're living in today. So first and foremost, I just want to thank you all, especially Lori and Anna, for working with me as we have prepared for this time, and preparing for such a time in the midst of so much unknown, and in the midst of so much, in some respects, I feel like it's instability, right? Because it's hard to find our footing when things keep shifting, when things keep happening, and when those things that happen remind us over and over again that we actually are not in control of anything. It's one of those things that I intellectually know, right? But I would still live my life in a way that's like, no, I can control this or that. And if 2020 taught me nothing else, or I would say, honestly, for me, if the last 5 years taught me nothing else, it's that I really am not in control of anything, even my own feelings. So here we are. I am delighted to be with you all today. And I know that this will be shared with others in the other gatherings of the conferences throughout the Synod. And so I'm delighted to be with you all today. I also appreciated the introductory remarks as it related to our technology usage. We're trying something new. And so fingers crossed, hands clasped together in prayer, open to the divine that this will work, whatever this is. And so, yes. So I am in Houston, Texas, and I am excited to share some thoughts with you all today, but also to invite you to some reflection around not just this theme, but around grief and relationships and love. I cannot speak to any group or be with any group without talking about those things in some way, shape, or form, but especially in this moment, as I am excited to be with women who are a part of my faith family and who are active members in the Women of the ELCA. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this time. And I look forward to the conversations that we will have. So we are going to do a variety of things in the time that I have with you. We're going to engage in a grounding exercise to begin with. We're going to engage in some conversations about each of these areas, about grief, about relationships, and about love. And you're going to be invited into some small group breakouts to continue or deepen in conversation as we continue to explore this topic. Now, if we were in person, right, I would say that I am someone who really enjoys the dialogue and the conversation, right? So I enjoy seeing your faces. I enjoy feedback. I don't always ask rhetorical questions. A lot of the questions that I ask are actually for someone to respond. And given the virtual reality, please feel free to use the chat box. If there is something that you're thinking or something that's sparked, please feel free to drop comments or thoughts or even questions in the chat. And if you are advanced enough to know how to use the raise your hand function on Zoom, which is essentially, if you look at the bottom, there's a thing that says reactions, and then there are various reactions you can use. So that's my way of inviting you to give either the amen or to raise your hand if you have a question or something that you'd like to share, right? So there are various reactions there, and you can use those at any time. So we're going to begin with a meditation, a guided visualization, if you will. One of the things that I have been exploring over the last few years is other ways of engaging the spirit and of opening up myself, right, to divine wisdom. And I have done that in conjunction with the exploration of my own ancestry. So I am Black and I am Afro-Caribbean, specifically Puerto Rican. And one of the things that I have come to learn is that there were various, both indigenous and historical ways of engaging in spirit and divine that my ancestors practiced that were considered to be I'll just use the word that people were told, right? Demonic, when they were coming up. And as they then connected on the island of Puerto Rico with the Catholic Church, because that was the church of the Spaniards, of those who were colonizing the island, there was a way that certain things became embedded, right, in the religious tradition in order to keep connection to ancestral ways of knowing and being. And so I've been exploring that in my own life. And one of the things that has really struck me is the power of not just meditation, but visualizations and inviting people to breathe together as we come to engage with spirit in our midst. So even as we are scattered across and in different spaces, this moment is inviting us to be present with one another and to ultimately create space for spirit to invite us into deeper knowing and being. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and this is always, I always believe in consent. So if you don't want to do any of this, you don't have to, right? So this is just an invitation. So what I'm going to invite you to do, and I'm shifting in my chair, is to sit as straight as you can in your chair. And if possible, we want our feet touching the ground, if that's possible. And one of the reasons that is an important thing is because it connects us back to the earth, to God's creation, to each other. And then if you're comfortable, you can place your palms up on your thighs, right? And you just are going to sit. I will be closing my eyes. You can close your eyes. You can turn off your video, whatever you feel comfortable with in this moment. And we're going to begin with breathing. And then I'm going to invite you to imagine something. So all you have to do is be present and listen to the sound of my voice. You don't have to do anything else, all right? So I'm just going to invite you to breathe as you normally would. And I just want you to notice what you're feeling in your body. And as you breathe, I want you to imagine before you a body of water. It could be any kind of water. Just want you to take a moment to visualize this body of water. And keep breathing. Now I want you to notice the movement of this water, if there's any. What is the movement that the water is engaging? And keep breathing. Now I want you to notice, is there anything that you see in or on the water? Are there things that you see that are in or on the water? It could be leaves or rocks. It could be branches. Just notice what's in or on the water. And keep breathing. Now I want you to get closer to, if you are not already, to this body of water. And I want you to enter the body of water. Notice how it feels and how you feel. What happens when you engage with this water in physical form? Keep breathing. I'm going to invite us to take 3 deep breaths in and out together, and we're going to breathe in through our nose and we're going to release through our mouth. So breathe in deeply and blow it out. One more time, in deeply and out. Breathe in and out. And as you're ready, I invite you to come back into this moment. And I believe you were asked, or you all have maybe something to write with or write on a piece of paper, something in front of you. And so I'm going to give you some information and then I'm going to invite you to reflect on it for a moment, okay? So the body of water, right, that came up in your mind's eye represents your soul, right? It represents inner wisdom and inner knowing. I didn't tell you what body of water to choose, right? It came up for you, and maybe it took a moment to come up. That's okay. I've done this before, and my best friend's mom was doing it, and she was like, I can't see the water. It's okay. It's okay. We're just starting to notice, right? So the first and foremost, the body of water represents your soul, your inner knowing. Secondly, the movement of the water, right? The movement of the water represents your feelings, represents your emotions, okay? Third, the things that you noticed in or on the water represent your thoughts. The things that you noticed in or on the water represent your thoughts. And lastly, right, you entering in the water and the feelings that came up with that represents your body, like your physical being, right? So the body of water itself represents your soul. The movement of the water represents your feelings. The things that are in or on the water represent your thoughts. And then you engaging in, submerging in the water is your physical form, your body. So I'm going to invite you to just take a moment to jot down what things are coming up for you as you reflect on those things. What are you thinking? How are you feeling? What is your body trying to tell you? What is your spirit inviting you to know, right? And not to know up here, but to know in the gut, right? To know in the being of the beings. So I'm just going to invite you just for a couple of minutes to jot down some of your thoughts. Now, I'd like to invite you to share, and we'll do this as a large group, right? If there are things that came up for you that you would be willing to share with the group, we're going to create a little bit of space, create a container, if you will. Is there anything that came up for you that you'd like to share, right, in welcoming? I just want to thank you all, right, for engaging that and for spending some time reflecting on the things that are within you, right? And one of the things that this time in particular has reminded me, because remember I started with we're not in control, is that I do have the power to curate space and moments in my life to get in touch with what I'm feeling and with what I'm thinking and with what I'm wondering and hoping, all of that, right? We have the power to do that. And I think that when we believe that we don't have the power of the time, right, we're letting either fear or scarcity or the worries of the world overwhelm us, rather than just to simply be and spend some time in reflection, right? Which is, I think, what God just invites us to, because we're able to access some resources that maybe we've been longing for and didn't spend the time to do. So thank you for that. And one of the reasons I use that particular guided visualization is because water is so important to me, right? I mean, I'm a July baby, I'm a water sign, I'm a Cancer, and I love being by bodies of water. Even though I didn't learn how to swim until I was an adult, I just love being near or in water. And as I think about grief, right, as I think about the ways that I have experienced grief, the metaphor that always comes up for me is around water, is around waves, especially, right? So as I think about grief, I think about this notion that grief comes in waves, right? There is an event or something that happens that brings about loss in our lives, where we experience loss. And that's basically what grief is, right? Grief is the experience of loss. Loss of people, loss of dreams, loss of connection, loss of identity, right? Grief is simply loss. And we've experienced a lot of loss collectively over the last year or longer. And here's the thing, all of us have experienced grief personally, right? But it's something different when we start to see that everyone around us is experiencing that loss. And then that loss doesn't just stop with one thing, right? We had the pandemic, and we had the death, and we had the loss of the ability to gather in community, right? The places and spaces that we would go to normally deal with difficult times, or to find sustenance, right? Even though we're doing stuff online, just to be in the presence, to gather around the coffee machine, to engage in meal. For me, it's brunch. I am missing brunch, right? I'm missing that time with my friends where we just would sit for hours talking and connecting and laughing and crying in each other's presence. And so we've experienced this collectively, and it becomes compounded. So even as I started and I was saying that I felt the tears, right? There's been this like compounding reality. And we're just now coming out of another experience that was traumatic for many with the winter storm. So grief is all around us. And it's something that I think within our society, we've been told that we have to contain or press down. And one of the things that I've been inviting folks to recently, especially folks of faith, is that I think that God invites us to enter into grief, to enter into loss, to actually lean in instead of pulling back, right? To lean in instead of pulling back. And I don't think it's just an invitation that God issues to us. I think it's actually something that God in God's divine wisdom does God's self, right? We very rarely see God pulling back. We see God speaking to, entering into, inviting us to spend time with grief and to become aware of those things that grieve us, right? So on the one hand, the experience of loss, right, brings about grief. On the other hand, experiences that actually chip away at the humanity of our siblings, right? Experiences that actually show us that people are living out the lie of scarcity rather than trusting the promise of abundance can grieve us. So the text that I've been contemplating on as we were preparing for this time, it comes to us from the prophet Isaiah and from Isaiah 58, verses 6 through 12. And you all are going to do some digging into that with the Bible study time. But the reason that I love this text is because it for me, talks about grief, relationships, and love in ways that speak to my heart for justice, right? So in this particular section of scripture, the prophet Isaiah is basically saying the things that you have been doing that you say honor God are not the things that God actually wants of us, right? Are not the things that are actually dealing with that which grieves God. And in verse 6, right, the prophet Isaiah is inviting us to look deeply at what is it that God is actually inviting us to when God talks about fasting and true worship. And it's to actually address those very things that grieve God and ultimately should grieve us, right? The injustice that's present, the lack of access to resource, right? The oppression that we see. These are the things that really grieve God and in turn grieve us, right? As people of faith, as people who are invited into this story. And so the first kind of conversation piece I'd like for you to have, and you're going to do this within small groups, is for you to spend a moment sharing with each other what are the losses that you've experienced, right, as you think about this last year. And again, I don't want us to do the thing that we as women can often do, which is to belittle our own loss or feelings. Well, you know, I lost this ability to gather with my friends, but you know, so-and-so experienced death and all of that. And so my loss doesn't compare to theirs. Well, no, loss is loss is loss, right? So I just want you to spend some time reflecting on the losses that you've experienced. And then the second thing I'd like you to do is to then think about what are the things that you're seeing within our society, within our communities that are grieving you, right? That bring about that profound sense of pain. And sometimes that pain can be so overwhelming that we pull back from it. But what is it that God is inviting you into, right? So I want you to spend a little bit of time talking about the loss that you've experienced and a little bit of time talking about that which grieves you. Are there any questions about that? Yep, thank you, Lori. What are the losses you've experienced? And then what are things that grieve you that you are noticing in the world around us? Any questions about that? All right. So I believe, Lori, you're going to move them into small groups and you'll get an invitation on your screen. And we'll have just about 5 minutes. It's not going to be a long time, right? Just about 5 minutes for you to engage, okay? So I would just invite you in the chat box, if there are things that from the what's grieving you, right? Let's just hear what's grieving you in the chat. You can type in as it relates to things happening around us. What are some of the things that are grieving you that you've noticed in your life or in our larger collective community as a whole, right? So we're grieving, like we've experienced loss, and we're grieving a lot that is happening around us. And that grief can be so overwhelming that a lot of times the response is either to totally shut down and pull back, right? Or to continue moving as if those things aren't true. And again, one of the things that I found is that there is something about those things that we are feeling and sensing and noticing that are inviting us into, right, this space. I call this grief space, right? Liminal space that invites us in, that is uncomfortable, that brings up stuff within us, but that also is a place where God has promised to be, right? Where God is inviting us into, because by entering into that space, we're not only accompanying those who are there, but we're also being mindful of the ways in which God is at work, right? So it could be very easy for us to grieve and to shut down and to pull back. And I say this as someone, right, who I live with depression, you know, pulling back, shutting down has been a way of being for me that's been at some points a coping mechanism, and other points just because I can't imagine doing or being another way. And when I'm well, for all intents and purposes, right, when I'm medicated, when I'm taking care of my health and my wellness, I find that when I do take the step towards grief and I create the space for grief, right, something miraculous happens. I'm able to feel the feels and to actually, I think about it in this way, that the grief is metabolized instead of it metastasizing, right? So we know that which is metabolized is used for energy. So our food, when we eat and our body metabolizes food, I'm turning 40 this year, and I don't know what's happening, but everything is slowed down. Everything is slowing down, and I'm not happy about that. I'm excited to. I've always wanted to grow older, because for me, older and wiser. I'm excited about being 40, and I'm not excited about the slowing down of things because I need the energy. But we know that our metabolism, right? The idea is that we take the food that we ingest, and that becomes energy that powers our body, right? Versus, yes, Lisa, it's wonderful to grow older. Like I'm excited. I'm excited. Versus something metastasizing, right? And as we think about metastatic, what comes to mind for me is immediately breast cancer. And I've had a few women in my life that have had that. And that which metastasized, right, takes over the healthy, right? And leads to, or can lead to, the death of healthy cells. And so the invitation for us is to metabolize the grief versus allowing the grief to metastasize when we're not attending to it. And I have found that the best way for grief to be metabolized is in relationship, is in community, is in connection. It is asking the questions and being with folks in the midst of the grief. Now, we're in a time and space where we can't necessarily physically be together, right? And one of the things that I've shared in other spaces is that one of the life-saving communities for me in the midst of a major depressive episode was online grief groups that helped me deal with my depression. There was something holy, and this was more than a decade ago now, right? There was something holy about those groups that allowed me to enter in and invited me to lean into my vulnerability and to trust, right, the space that was there, that didn't rush past the grief, that didn't try to sanitize the grief, but that created the space for the grief in order for it to be metabolized in a way that was ultimately life-giving, right? So as we think about the grief and the things that grieve us, and then we move to the fact that relationships, those things that I actually call revolutionary relationships, invite us to lean into the grief in order for the grief to be metabolized and to birth something new in us. This is also what we see the holy doing. This is what we see the divine doing. This is what we see God doing, right? And in Isaiah 58, we see God talking about that which grieves God and God's people, and then what the people are invited to do in relationship, how the people are invited to be in relationship, that then takes that injustice, right, and transforms it into a new way of being. And I believe that the relationships in our lives that do this have particular characteristics, right? So the first is relationships that are life-giving, right? These are relationships that actually breed life and not death, that invite us to show up fully as we are, that are creative, right? These are the types of relationships that we're invited to engage when the grief seems like it will overwhelm or overtake us. The second aspect of these relationships are relationships that invite us to take risk. And I say risk as it relates to divine risk, right? So these are relationships that invite us to step out on faith and to show up maybe differently than we've shown up in the past. But they give us the space to try out new things, to imagine what could be possible. That's one of my favorite questions that I ask as a coach of clients. What might be possible if ... right? So these are relationships that invite us to take risk. Third, these types of relationships where we are able to metabolize our grief are relationships that are vulnerable. one of my laments when I used to work in congregations is that the very space where we were invited to show up broken was the space that then became a space where people felt like they had to show up with facades or had to show up as if everything was together. And I remember when I was in Atlanta, the church I worked at was Redeemer, and we had this beautiful atrium. And I would stand up one Sunday, I was standing on the balcony, like looking over to the atrium, and I was just thinking to myself, man, I wish so-and-so knew that so-and-so was also going through a divorce right now, right? Because there would be something powerful that would come out of that connection. Or I wish so-and-so knew that so-and-so was also dealing with caregiving of a parent, right, that had lost particular capacities or functions. Or I wish so-and-so knew that so-and-so's child was struggling with depression. But we, for whatever reason, have sanitized our spaces of faith to be spaces where people are not invited to show up vulnerably as they are and actually lean into the struggle, right? And so these relationships invite us to be vulnerable. These relationships are also gracious, right? They invite us to not just practice grace with one another, but to also practice grace with ourselves. Have you ever thought about the things that you say to yourself in the midst of struggle and recognize that you would probably never say those things to someone else who is struggling, right? So the fact that we actually lack compassion and grace for ourselves. And when I think about relationships, I think about not just the relationship that God has with us or that we have with God, and not just the relationship that we have with each other, but the relationship that we have with ourselves, right? So Barbara says, out of these grieving events, I have discovered that there are people near and far who do care for their neighbor and reach in ways that have been so reassuring. Yes, phone calls, errands, knocks on the doors for distance visits, like neighborhoods of old, right? Both here in Georgetown and in New York City. These, to me, are grace moments, right? And I feel like this last week, I've experienced that as well, even with the response to this donation drive that we're doing and getting plumbing supplies in the ways that people are so gracious. And I often wondered, what would it be like for us to be that before the proverbial ish hits the fan, right? Before the struggle happens? What would it be like for us to practice that way of being in our day-to-day? These relationships are also accountable. They invite us into accountability. And when I think about accountability, I think about relationships with people that remind me of who I am and of how I have said that I wanted to show up in the world, right? So the people in my life remind me, Rozella, you are gifted, you have the ability and the capacity, and you also said that this is something that you value. So how are you showing up in a way that's in alignment with your beliefs and your values, right? So these relationships call us into accountability. These relationships are also forgiving. And again, it's not just about with others, but it's also with ourselves, right? They invite us into the expanse of forgiveness that is for all of us. And they're diverse. And when I say diverse, I'm not just talking about race and ethnicity, even though that's one form of diversity. I'm talking about age and class and ability and identity and orientation, right? Here are the relationships where we can take our grief and that grief can then become metabolized and something new can be uplifted. Now, here's the beautiful thing, right? When we see in Isaiah 58, God not only exposes what grieves God's own self, but then invites us into relationships that then bring about healing and restoration. And not just for the other, but for ourselves as well. So for me, when I think about these conversations around grief and relationships and love, I'm invited to consider what happens when I take this seriously. And what happens is healing, is restoration, is wholeness, right? These are the things that come out of us leaning in rather than pulling back. So my second invitation for you to engage in conversation is to respond to this question. As you consider, right, the grief and the loss that you've experienced, and as you've considered relationships with others, with God, and even with yourself, How is God inviting you to show up in this moment? How is God inviting you to show up in this moment? And you will have 5 minutes again. So just know it's a short time, but we're just priming the pump, right? We're priming the pump. So you'll have 5 minutes in your small groups, and then we'll come back together for our final part. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back.
Okay.
So I'm going to invite you to share some of your thoughts to that question in the chat of how is God inviting you to show up in this moment? How is God inviting you to show up in this moment? And one of the beautiful things about engaging that question in conversation is that maybe something was brought up that you hadn't thought about, or maybe something was brought up that resonated very deeply with you and also shows that you're not alone, right? So it helps to create some synergy, if you will, as we consider the ways that we're being called to show up. So how is God inviting you to show up in this moment? So the last thing I just wanted to share was just briefly thoughts around love, right? So we've talked about grief, we've talked about relationships and how kind of grief then is metabolized within the context of relationships. And for me, all of this connects to love. One of my favorite quotes, and I don't know who originated it, but a few different people have said it, is that grief is the price we pay for love, right? Grief is the price we pay for love, for having loved and having lost, right? And so I believe that the more we love, right, that there is a relationship to then the amount of grief that we will feel, because there is this correlation between the two. And so when I think about this last year, or even the last 5 years, if we go back, right, in that, a lot of us are grieving either the lives we thought we had, or the ways that we viewed the world and how it worked, or the things that we valued. Like there was a lot of loss in that because there was a lot of love there. There was a lot of connection there. And so again, the invitation to this grief space is also an invitation to honor what we lost and what we loved. And I think the beautiful thing about love is that love never diminishes. It only ever continues to expand. And so I keep using the word invitation, but I believe that we are called, right, to imagine love that is expansive. And the way that I define love is not that something that is a sentimental emotion, right? It is an action. It is a force in the world. And it's a force that's defined or characterized by three things. So where love is, there is creativity, right? And I take this directly from the Trinity. I take this from who God is, right? If God is love and love is God, then there's some very tangible characteristics that we can pull from that. So the first for me is where there is creativity, there is love, right? And that is that which is life-giving. That is that which sparks beauty. That is that which reveals truth, right? Creativity is this first marker of God, and is the first thing that we see God and God's divine wisdom doing. God created, right? The second way that I know that love is present is where there is liberation, right? And for me, that moves to the second person of the Trinity, that moves to the person that we understand is Jesus. And Jesus was and came to liberate. Jesus was the liberator who came to liberate. So we know that love exists where liberation occurs. And liberation is more than just freedom, right? Freedom implies, I feel like for me, an individual way of being like, I am free to do X, Y, and Z. Liberation is really about the collective. And going back to this text in Isaiah, we see this collective invitation, or this invitation to collective liberation. One of my favorite other quotes is by a woman named Laura Watson, and she's an Aboriginal activist in Australia. And I feel like so many people have heard this, where she talked about people coming to do mission or service trips. And she would say, if you've come here to help me or help our community, you can go home, right? We're not necessarily in need of your help to engage the work before us. But if you've come here because you understand that our liberation is bound, right, then let us get to work. Let us be in relationship as we are seeking the bound liberation, right? So we know that love exists where there is liberation. And lastly, for me, the